Do you have an idea of when this might go to bid?
I don't want to take a guess at that. I would like to go back and get our most current estimates on that for you.
All right, I know some of my Democratic colleagues and I had the benefit of a presentation by some tech folks at a policy retreat not long ago, and maybe we can, do you remember that? We had a great presentation. I don't remember his name, but the suggestion was that we don't need these legacy operations to sell us the moon and then charge us 3 times for it, but that there's some fast on-the-ground younger folks who know how to do this and could piece it together. You may be too far into your process for us to be able to offer some suggestions, but that's just an idea, and I will see if I can find who that person was and see if there's any assistance that could be offered.
That would be very, very helpful. Thank you.
And then switching subjects, I just wanted to ask a brief question with regard to just the more comprehensive nature of the cleanups themselves. What's the nature of the community involvement or process? Because so often, as we saw many of these situations devolve, and I'm thinking Exide among others, that we heard some really heartbreaking stories from community members who have been so devastated by the impact of the irresponsibility of some of these companies. How do you hear from those impacted that what you're doing is on target?
There are a couple of ways that we do that. On a site-specific basis, we do community outreach when we're in the site discovery process. When we're gathering information about the contamination, and we let people know that we're doing that and that there will be a cleanup at the site. There are required milestones for public participation in the decision-making about the site. Our efforts typically go above and beyond that by a fairly good margin. We hold a lot of in-community meetings. We also, as a department, although we don't have a policy board, we hold quarterly public meetings where we advise the community and anyone interested about what we're working on, and we allow them to give us input into that. And our last community meeting was held a month ago, and it was specifically focused on cleanup sites. So that's one way in which we do it. We have newsletters. We have quite a lot of information on our website. We have a database called EnviroStore, where people can access our information and can go into the database on a site-by-site basis and look at everything we're doing in regards to a site, all the documents that are available, see the time frames involved. There are a number of other mechanisms as well. Maybe it would be helpful if we could provide you with a summary of that.
I would appreciate that, and I am pleased to hear what you're telling us and would only encourage you to further invest to the degree that you can, because that's what this is all about, right? Not only protecting lives, but also giving those communities a sense that, number one, we care, that we more than care, we're concerned, we're engaged, and that we're there to address the problems that have been created. And perception is probably half the battle. So if you've got a community that really hears from you and understands your sincere intent, that'll take you a long distance.
I appreciate that. I've actually spent a lot of time in the last 6 months traveling around the state to communities, including weekend bus tours and a number of other mechanisms to meet with the people living in the communities affected by the sites that we regulate. We also are expecting our newly appointed Assistant Director for Environmental Justice to start work in a couple of weeks. On the 30th.
Is this a new person or a new office?
Both. It's a new office and it's a new person.
Terrific.
So she will be starting, and her name is Ana Mascareñas. She is just last week graduated from UCLA with her master's in public health, has an extensive background in community engagement and environmental justice work. She lives in the Boyle Heights neighborhood near Exide, and we're really looking forward to having her come on board.
Sounds like a good fit.
And we also have a public participation modernization effort underway, working under contract with UC Davis, and they're doing surveys of communities and others around the state to get a better understanding of the needs of communities in terms of access to information and input into our process so that we can enhance what we're doing and better meet their needs.
All good news. Thank you. Continued success.
Well, thank you, Director Lee and Ms. Hardy, for your testimony this morning. And now I'd like to invite representatives from the State of California's Auditor's Office to make a presentation. Welcome. Yeah, it should be.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for inviting our office to discuss the audit and update you on the department's efforts to implement the recommendations from the audit. My name is Tammy Lozano. I was the audit principal for this audit, and with me I have Aaron Fellner, who was the team leader, which is our audit supervisor. The Joint Legislative Audit Committee approved a request asking us to look at the department's processes and whether they had an effective process for recovering the costs, as the director mentioned. In our audit, she kind of already described, we had updated the outstanding costs at $194 million and more than 16 projects, and that was as of March 2014. In our report, the department's of the department's cost recovery processes, we noted that the department is unlikely to recover millions of dollars in outstanding costs due to several factors, including the statute of limitations has probably already expired on a number of projects totaling $13.4 million. The department cannot verify the billing status in many of the projects due to poor documentation. Some of the outstanding costs may have been overstated in the billing system because they were never adjusted when they received settlement payments under settlement agreements. And there are also outstanding costs totaling $73 million related to projects that were affected by bankruptcy or are in ongoing litigation. And the department doesn't know how much it will collect until those legal processes have concluded. We made several recommendations to the department. As the director mentioned, there were 9 to the department, 2 to the legislature, to improve the department's efforts in collecting outstanding costs and to improve the data in its billing system. We have a follow-up process, as she also mentioned, at 60 days, 6 months, and 1 year. The 1-year response is due actually in August. And Aaron's gonna talk about a few of the recommendations and the status as of the 6-month response, which they provided in February.
Hello. Yeah, since DTSC has already briefed you on the 6 fully implemented recommendations, I'll just be taking you through the 3 partially implemented and the 2 legislative recommendations. The first of which concerns the recovery tools used by DTSC to recover costs. We found that DTSC was not consistently using liens against responsible parties as real property. When we asked, they indicated that their procedures were unclear at the time. We made a recommendation that they update those procedures. This recommendation is only partially implemented because although DTSC has provided us with some revised procedures for that, as of February 2015, and as the director indicated earlier, there's a Court of Appeals opinion that does cast some concerns about that process. So DTSC is still evaluating that. It's still partially implemented.
Is the problem with, tell me about the Court of Appeals. Is it they don't have the authority to put the lien on?
According to DTSC's 6 months response, it seems to have to do with what their lien hearing procedures may not comply with constitutional due process principles. If you want more information than that, you'll have to talk to them. Hopefully in their August response, they will provide some additional information about that evaluation that they're doing. So. Moving on to the next, we've talked a little bit about Fiscal so far, and our concern isn't so much what new system DTSC decides to use, is that all of the data that they have is clean when they put it in the new system. So the department has indicated that the outstanding costs will all be resolved as of July 2016. So if that date holds, that's great, but they should not put any of that data that's currently still being evaluated into their new procurement until the time it's cleaned up. So that's remained partial. And finally, concerning the amounts under $5,000, DTSC has made some efforts over the past 10 months. They have issued guidance to staff about discharging or writing off projects with amounts between $25 and $500, and those projects are already closed. Now, they did an analysis back before the audit was released that showed that depending on the complexity of the project, it would take between $1,000 and $8,000 to, recover some costs. So it could cost way more than the $5,000. Could cost up to about $8,800, or it could cost very little to collect that money. So, our recommendation was, well, write off what you can, but to the extent you can collect, do so. And we hope that they do initiate that analysis. Regarding the two legislative recommendations, the first was concerning the interest payments, the interest rate charged on late payments. Currently, state law requires that the department use the state surplus money investment fund rate for late payments. That's called the SMIF rate for short. It's low. We found in the report, we just took one quarter. In June 30th, 2013, the SMIF rate was 0.246%, so 1/4%. Meanwhile, the BOE, the Board of Equalization, over the same period was using a 6% rate. And I think we found that, just on one late invoice, the DTSC had to charge $654 on, a $100,000 invoice versus $10,000 that a higher rate would have been able to achieve. So that spawned our first legislative recommendation, which was to give that the legislature should revise state law to allow the department to use a higher rate. Finally, we also found that the department was also limited in its ability to recover costs effectively because it couldn't require financial information from potentially responsible parties. It could only request that information and then would have to sue them for it later. And basically, it didn't allow them to weed out who wasn't financially viable and who was. And you kind of need that as quick as possible if you want to start these recovery efforts early. So that takes us through the partially implemented recommendations and the current department status on their implementation. And we're happy to take any questions.
Members have questions? Go ahead. Mr. Leno.
Thank you. Just to follow up on the necessity for the new platform, do you have any thoughts or suggestions, recommendations for the department as to how they should proceed, or are there any markers that we should be looking at as they prepare to put this to bed?
No, our primary concern was that in the past, before they implemented CRBS, their old billing system, they had moved bad data from their legacy system from the 90s into CRBS, thus kind of continuing the garbage in, garbage out cycle. So we thought, well, before they try to do this again with Fiscal, let's make sure that they clean up all of the data. That was really more the focus than whatever platform or IT procurement they decided to use.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You referenced the interest charge, and certainly with a low interest rate, there's no incentive for someone to pay that fine because they could perhaps get a better investment elsewhere with those funds. So you mentioned legislatively we have to make that change, and would that similarly be applied to requesting financial data from those debtors and having that legislatively changed as well? And we should look into that, I think. If
That's correct, yes.
so both of those would require legislation.
Mm-hmm. Alejo over there.
That's what's coming up.
Yeah, it's coming up.
I like it. Thank you.
Beautifully.
Transition right in.
Could I just,
Yes.
you know, there's such a common thread going through so much of this with oversight and the inability to collect funds and the sort of the fact that our systems are old and kind of not integrated and not updated. As the LAO's office, do you have any suggestions for us, not only with this agency, which I do want to thank you for trying to, you know, sometimes it's like trying to put a square peg into a round hole. We have old systems, we have sort of a mindset that is, let's leave things as they are, while we're pushing to try to make things better. And yet the technology, it just doesn't fit. Whether it's because, as Senator Leno pointed out, we have a system in place that almost requires us to deal with these huge companies that move at the speed of, you know, maple syrup in winter, and it's distressing. This is it's kind of like a little deja vu all over again, as has been pointed out by some who are more articulate than I. I just wonder, do you have any thoughts on, based upon not only your analysis, but your recommendations? How do we break this cycle, both, you know, in this agency, but also in others where we really need to develop those 21st century technologies? They're out there, the platforms, the software, whatever you want to call it, it's there. But we don't seem to be able to catch that wave and go with it. We just find ourselves spending enormous amounts of money, getting nowhere, and further embarrassing the agency and, frankly, the state by a level of incompetence that just seems to continue.
Oh, I wish there was an easy answer for you. You know, we've been monitoring the implementation of Fiscal for years and issuing you know, quarterly reports on that, and you know that implementation continues to come apace. But there's not a quick fix. You know, even oversight sometimes doesn't even seem to quite push things along as we'd like.
Well, I know that Secretary Maribel Badger is working on this, and she's with the General Services, I think, and it just I can't believe that we can't crack this nut. And to hear you say that there's no simple answer just leaves me kind of empty with enthusiasm here. I mean, has your shop tried to do anything on this? Where do we go to get? It's just incredible to me. This is not a problem just with this agency, but so many others. How do we fix this problem? I mean, we're chasing our tails here.
And again, you know, I think our oversight that we've been exercising over Fiscal has helped to keep everyone informed about where the project is. And I think that's probably the best you're going to get, is that level of transparency that you need before you've spent billions and billions of dollars, as the case management system for AOC is kind of the perfect example of that I was also on the audit of. So.
They need to be updated. I mean, what happens is they mess up and we dump the system and we chide them and we, you know, we throw up our hands and say we can't spend any more money on this. Meanwhile, they have no system because the old one didn't work, and they're slogging along, not advancing. I mean, we have to get rid of the old, but that doesn't mean, well, we're not gonna try to upgrade it. The goal in the first place was to get them into the 21st century. You know, these are agencies that are large, and this, because this state is large. You know, when you're talking about 38, 40 million people, that requires levels of efficiency that I know this governor has been, you know, stomping on the table for. And yet what we do is we end up with systems that don't work, and then we just, you know, what are we doing, for example, with the AOC? Is there a new system that's been proposed? No. So I mean, obviously, we have got to figure out, I think this is one of our biggest challenges, is to find a way that we can run the state more efficiently using the technologies that are developed here. The companies are here. The small, you know, the lighter, more flexible, younger, not necessarily age-wise, but, you know, people who see the future without all that baggage of a big corporation with huge payrolls, they can do this work. I would like to see the LAO as part of its function, rather than come here and tell us it's not a simple answer, to help us find the answer and to work with the Department of General Services, to work with these various agencies and come up with something. This has been a problem for decades, and I am beginning to lose patience, and I think we all are. We need to make this whole process run more efficiently, enforce the laws that we've got to protect the public, and also work with these businesses. I mean, I think that directive is clear. Now, let's just make it happen. I would like, Mr. Chair, to ask these folks to come back again at some time in the not-too-distant future with some answers, with some proposals.
Well, evidently in August, we're going to have another report.
There you go.
So
Well,
that's a date. Yeah, I mean, I expect this is a big problem. I think you highlighted, we have some recommendations that are partially implemented. I mean, I have some questions, I guess, on some of the recommendations. I think you heard my comment on the $5,000 write-off. I mean, I think that they've implemented a program with the itty-bitty, this under $500, and again, it's bad data, don't put it into the next system. And then they can consult with the Department of Finance, which is this legislative body's favorite department nowadays, is the Department of Finance. But it's the lack of authority. I mean, it seems to me that the recommendation is that if it's more than $5,000, you should pursue that. And I don't know if they have the authority, as we would in a business. You say we've got all this bad debt, or all this uncollectible debt, all this old debt, and maybe the statute of limitations hasn't exactly run, but it's not worth our time to do this. We're a public health. You know, we're worried about contamination cleanup, and sometimes it's just better to eat that cost, right? And again, you came in with a recommendation at the 5,000 level, and we have legislation. I know you're not going to comment on legislation, but I'm trying to figure out I'm trying to give the tools to the agency that will say, okay, good, bad. Again, some people you should pursue $1,000, and it won't be that hard. So, can you give me your thought on that hard line?
Well, it's really more of a guide, because we understood that depending on the complexity of the case, it could be very easy to resolve the outstanding cost. But that in certain instances, it just did not seem worth the effort of the department for complex cases, especially involving very small responsible parties. When you had the several large ones already out there, and that we did identify such a large bulk of projects that would take a lot of time and effort for DTSC to go through, when really it would only resolved around $1.2 million worth of outstanding costs. So that analysis hinged on what's the cost benefit for them. And to the extent that they do want to review some of these projects to see, okay, for the easy ones, let's clear those out and send out that bill so we can make sure that's resolved. But in other cases, is this just too much work based on the analysis that they'd already performed for their workflow, to say that clearly way more work than necessary. So I think that's why we came up with that $5,000 line there, is because we could see, okay, here's this huge bulk, and it's really a small amount of money.
Yeah, no, it's a third. It's a third of the sites. All right, now we're going to open up. Thank you for your testimony. Now I'm going to ask members of the public if they'd like to make comments just on this oversight hearing. And we're going to get in a moment here, we're going to get into the legislative response. But if there's members who'd like to comment on the testimony that they heard today, not on pending legislation, but on the testimony they heard today, I'd like to invite them up. Seeing none, I'm going to conclude our oversight hearing with the Department of Toxic Substance Control, and that oversight hearing is adjourned. Now I'd like to open up our regular hearing. In first order of business assistance, I'm going to convene the legislative hearings for the special session, or special order of business, which is Assembly Bills 273 through Assembly Bill 276. Assistant Mr. Alejo, I see, is here, the chair of the committee. Please call the roll to establish a quorum.
Members Wykowski.
Aye. Are here.
Wykowski here. Gaines. Bates. Bates here. Hill. Hill here. Jackson. Jackson here. Leno. Leno here. Pavley. Pavley here.
We have a quorum. Senator Hill, is there a motion to approve the consent calendar? So move. Please call the roll.